great artist, Mr. Paul Lynde.
At 45, Paul Lynde faced the unthinkable. Hollywood whispered that he was being blacklisted, not for a crime, not for a scandal in the papers, but for something far more personal. He had refused to leave the side of his longtime partner. In an era when love itself could end a career, that defiance carried a brutal price. Offers slowed. Studio calls went silent. Friends turned cautious. Behind the laughter of his sharp one-liners was a man terrified of losing everything he had fought to build. But to understand how Paul reached that crossroads, we must go back to the beginning, to the small-town boy who learned early that humor was both a weapon and a shield. Paul Edward Lynde was born on the 13th of June, 1926, in Mount Vernon, Ohio, a small Midwestern town wrapped in quiet streets and conservative values. His father, Hoy, ran a meat market, while his mother, Sylvia, kept a watchful home filled with routine. Paul was the fifth of 6 children, and in that large family, his voice often struggled to be heard. From an early age, he discovered that humor was his way to stand out, a spark that made people pause and laugh in the middle of ordinary days. The world outside Mount Vernon was changing rapidly. The Roaring Twenties had given way to the Great Depression, leaving families clinging to stability wherever they could find it. Radios hummed in kitchens with Bing Crosby crooning about dreams, while movie houses filled with glamorous images of Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. For a boy like Paul, those voices and faces weren't just entertainment. They were promises of a life larger than the one mapped out for him in Ohio. School was never his sanctuary. Paul's sharp wit masked a loneliness that few noticed. He battled weight issues and endured teasing from classmates. Yet, instead of retreating, he polished his humor into armor, perfecting the biting sarcasm that later became his trademark. Beneath the laughter, however, sat a young man who felt different in ways he could not yet put into words. By the late 1932, as the country edged toward World War II, society grew more rigid. Masculinity was defined in uniforms, jobs, and church pews. In Mount Vernon, expectations were clear. Boys became breadwinners, girls became homemakers, and any deviation invited suspicion. For Paul, who secretly felt drawn away from those norms, it was a quiet prison. Still, hope flickered. He fell in love with the stage, performing in school plays and local shows, relishing the applause that seemed to momentarily erase his insecurities. After graduating high school, he set his sights beyond Ohio's borders. The cultural winds of the 1942 carried swing music, zoot suits, and an America rebuilding itself after war. For Paul, this was the perfect moment to escape small-town judgment and chase something bigger. He enrolled at Northwestern University in Illinois, a place brimming with theatrical energy and possibility. There, among other aspiring performers, he found a sense of belonging for the first time. The war years reshaped America, but they also reshaped Paul. Surrounded by creativity and ambition, he realized comedy wasn't just his escape. It was his destiny. The boy who once felt invisible was now stepping toward the lights of Broadway and Hollywood. At Northwestern, Paul Lynde sharpened his craft with intensity. He studied theater alongside future legends like Cloris Leachman and Charlotte Rae, building friendships that would last decades. His humor, acerbic, sly, and unexpected, stood out even in a room filled with talent. Professors recognized he had something rare. Not just timing, but an ability to turn insecurity into comedy that stung and delighted at once. After graduating in 1948, Paul packed his dreams and moved to New York City. The streets buzzed with jazz spilling from smoky clubs, neon marquees promising Broadway magic, and actors hustling for auditions. At first, he scraped by waiting tables and performing in small cabarets. Yet the city suited him. On those dimly lit stages, his wit blossomed. Audiences leaned in, laughing not just at his punchlines but at the bite underneath them. His breakthrough came in 1960 with the Broadway smash, Bye Bye Birdie. Cast as Harry McAfee, the uptight father of a teenage girl obsessed with a rock star, Paul stole the show with his deadpan delivery and explosive bursts of frustration. Critics hailed his comedic genius, and soon Hollywood took notice. When the film version was made in 1963, Paul reprised his role, giving him a national audience. Suddenly, he wasn't just a stage comedian. He was a recognizable star. Television beckoned. Guest appearances on variety shows displayed his biting humor, while his voice work for animated characters like the hooded villain in Charlotte's Web proved his range. But his most defining role came in 1965 when he joined Bewitched. As Uncle Arthur, the mischievous, wisecracking warlock, Paul became a fan favorite. Children adored his playful pranks, while adults caught the sly double meanings hidden in his lines. By the late 1960 seconds, Paul Lynde had crafted an image as the quick-witted comic who could make even the simplest line sparkle. His humor was sharp, sometimes bordering on cruel, but always irresistibly funny. Then came Hollywood Squares, where he became the center square for over a decade. With every quip, he cemented his reputation as television's king of innuendo, dropping coded jokes about sexuality that mainstream audiences laughed at without quite understanding. The fame was dazzling. He graced talk shows, toured colleges, and found his face splashed across magazine covers. Yet the higher he climbed, the more pressure mounted. Hollywood loved his jokes but demanded he remain a character, not a man. Behind the laughter, Paul carried a secret life, one he could never display under the blazing lights of 1960 seconds television. And as his star rose higher, the weight of that double life grew heavier with every passing year. Success gave Paul Lynde fame, but it also forced him deeper into secrecy. Hollywood in the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds was unforgiving. Studio contracts had morality clauses. Gossip magazines thrived on scandal. For a man like Paul, the wrong photograph or careless word could mean exile, so he built a double existence: the beloved comic on screen and the cautious, lonely man off it. Those who knew him privately described a man yearning for connection. He found companionship in discreet circles, gatherings at friends' homes, late-night parties in Los Angeles, and unpublicized trips to Palm Springs, where privacy was guarded as fiercely as gold. There, among trusted actors and industry insiders, Paul could finally breathe. He laughed more freely, dropped the caustic armor, and let affection show in touches and glances. He shared romances with men who understood the same risks. One longtime partner became his anchor, offering stability amid the chaos of show business. Friends recalled how fiercely Paul clung to that bond, refusing to bow to pressure to sever ties. The relationship was never public, but within the safe walls of their home, Paul allowed himself to be vulnerable. It was this devotion, whispered biographers later, that drew the ire of powerful figures in Hollywood who demanded he appear single. Other affairs were briefer but no less meaningful. He was drawn to fellow actors, often men who carried their own secrets. After television tapings or Broadway curtain calls, Paul might disappear into the night, finding solace in stolen hours. These were not casual encounters for him, they were attempts to claim fragments of love in a world that denied him the whole. The burden of hiding weighed heavily. He joked about bachelorhood on Hollywood Squares, twisting innuendo into humor. But those quips were more than comedy. They were coded messages, tiny flashes of truth disguised as punchlines. Audiences roared with laughter, never realizing how close they were to the real man behind the mask. Every relationship carried risk. Paparazzi prowled. Tabloids hinted. And studio executives watched nervously, worried their golden comic might draw the wrong kind of attention. Paul balanced on a tightrope, choosing between the warmth of love and the security of his career. It was a dangerous equation, one that grew increasingly unstable as his fame expanded. And then came the moment when rumors began to sharpen into threats, forcing Paul to confront the harsh cost of living between two worlds. By the mid-1970 seconds, Paul Lynde's jokes were still sharp, but the whispers grew louder. Columnists hinted at late-night parties. Reporters asked why television's funniest bachelor never settled down. In an industry that demanded conformity, Paul's private life was becoming harder to hide. There were incidents that fed the gossip, an arrest here, a public scuffle there, stories that tabloids twisted into lurid headlines. Each time, the studios rushed to smooth it over, but patience wore thin. Executives urged him to distance himself from his longtime partner, warning that public suspicion could ruin not only his career, but their investments. Paul refused. For him, love was not negotiable. The price was steep. Television offers slowed. Guest spots dried up. Producers whispered that he was difficult, a coded word often used when someone was suspected of being gay. Behind the scenes, doors quietly closed. To the public, he was still the smiling face at the center of Hollywood Squares. But to Paul, the blacklist felt real. He had become both indispensable and expendable at the same time. The pressure gnawed at him. He turned increasingly to alcohol, numbing the sting of rejection and loneliness. Friends described wild mood swings, from dazzling humor at dinner parties to crushing despair when the lights dimmed. His wit, once effortless, became edged with bitterness. He lashed out, sometimes alienating the very friends who tried to support him. Worse still was the isolation. Paul had built his life around making people laugh, but in private, he admitted to feeling desperately alone. Hollywood wanted the joke, not the man. And the man feared that if his truth was ever fully revealed, he would be erased. This period marked Paul's lowest point. Blacklisted, typecast, and battling his own demons, he seemed trapped in a cycle of decline. But just when it appeared the curtain might fall for good, Paul began searching for ways to reinvent himself, to find meaning beyond the rigid confines of the industry that had both made and broken him. As the 1,980 seconds approached, Paul Lynde was no longer the constant presence on television he once had been. Hollywood Squares remained his most famous stage, but even that spotlight began to dim. The blacklisting whispers had done their work. Yet Paul was not finished. He sought reinvention, taking roles in summer stock theater and college tours, where audiences still adored his sharp delivery and razor timing. The stage gave him something television never could: freedom to be looser, more authentic, even experimental. Touring productions of comedies and musicals brought him face to face with smaller crowds who came not for scandal, but for laughter. There, he was reminded that his gift still mattered. Young actors looked up to him, seeing in his sarcasm both a shield and a style. Culturally, the times were shifting. The sexual revolution had cracked open old barriers, and by the 1,980 seconds, younger stars were beginning to live a little more openly. Yet Paul remained cautious. He had lived too long under the shadow of secrecy to risk full disclosure. Still, he found quiet solace in chosen family, friends, confidants, and his loyal partner, who stood beside him even as Hollywood tried to push him aside. Health, however, began to weigh on him. Years of drinking and the stress of living double lives took their toll. In candid moments with close friends, Paul admitted regret not for loving who he loved, but for how much he had been forced to hide it. He longed for a world where humor could be his gift, not his disguise. In his final years, he reflected on the irony of his career. Audiences remembered the laugh lines, the dazzling one-liners, but few understood the cost of creating them. His bitterness softened into a quieter wisdom. He counseled younger performers to embrace themselves fully, even if the world was not ready. Paul Lynde passed away in 1982 at the age of 55, found in his Beverly Hills home. The news stunned fans who had grown up laughing with him. Many mourned the comic genius. Only a few understood the private battles he had endured. His legacy was complicated but undeniable. A pioneer of sly humor, a master of innuendo, and a man who lived bravely, if not fully openly, in an unforgiving era. And as the industry changed in the years after his death, Paul's story became a reminder of both how far Hollywood had come and how much it had once demanded in silence. Paul Lynde's story is one of laughter and loneliness, triumph and sacrifice. He gave America a reason to smile, even when he himself was hurting. Behind every sharp joke was a man wrestling with the cost of love in a time when the world refused to accept it. His blacklisting for standing by his partner shows the cruel choices forced upon so many in old Hollywood. Today, we see his legacy with new eyes. He was more than Uncle Arthur or the center square. He was a man who carved out space for humor that hinted at truths people were too afraid to say aloud. In doing so, he became both a shield and a signal for generations who would one day live more openly. Paul Lynde reminds us that fame is never free. It demands masks, sacrifices, and sometimes silence. But his story also teaches that courage can exist quietly, in loyalty to a partner, in refusing to bow to prejudice, and in the choice to keep laughing even when the world feels heavy. So as you think back on his legacy, ask yourself, how many others were forced into silence? And what do we owe to those who carried secrets so we might live more freely today? If you found Paul's story moving, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share which of his roles made you laugh the hardest. And subscribe so we can continue uncovering the hidden lives of Hollywood's greatest stars.